Welcome everybody to this special session of the Advanced Formation Summer webinar series. Doing this on a Friday because we had so many great speakers and wanted to get everybody in. We're going to be taking a break next week for our conference. So, and I thought I really liked the connection between Dr. Hippler's seminar or webinar on Wednesday, talking about C.S. Lewis and Brave New World, and then Dr. Furlan's talk today, which is going to focus on Aristotelian topics, ideas from Aristotle's metaphysics that are really going to be important for us as we face the Brave New World coming upon us. Dr. Furlan is a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College, and he also got his master's degree at the University of Chicago, and then went on to a PhD at Trinity College in Dublin. He is the editor of the Harvard Journal of Bioethics, and he is heading to the University of St. Thomas in Houston to take up a brand new chair. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, it's an endowed chair in ethics and ethical leadership at the University of St. Thomas.
Okay, very good. All right, well, take it away, Dr. Furlan.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be with everyone. Can everybody hear me okay and see me okay? Okay.
Looking good.
Okay, looking good. Okay. So
also, I should just say, as people go along, if you have some ideas or questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll probably wait until the end to address them, but feel free to share them as you go along.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to set some time aside at the end, about 10 minutes or so, for people to be able to raise any questions that they may have. So today I want to talk about the biotechnological revolution. I think this is a revolution that's going to transform really all of our lives. I think in many ways we're at a period that's analogous to the computer revolution in, say, 1983, 1984, something like that, where we're beginning to see new forms of biotechnology that have the potential to really revolutionize every aspect of human existence, right? So not only by delivering therapeutic treatments and cures, which is very important to recognize, right? That there is tremendous potential therapeutic benefit here to be able to treat diseases like ALS or Huntington's or sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. That would be a tremendous good. It's so important to recognize that the tremendous therapeutic value that's present here. Advocates for biotech enhancement will often emphasize this, and this is an important point, right? So it's also important, though, to recognize that not only will these technologies offer therapeutic treatments and cures and seek to restore health or preserve health, they will also seek to go beyond health as well and go beyond therapy. And that's a really important distinction I think that everyone should be aware of here, is that I've never met anyone who's opposed to the use of these technologies for the sake of health, to preserve health, to restore health, right, for therapy. I think the much more interesting and difficult ethical, social, and political questions arise when we start to go in the direction of enhancement, right? When we start to move in that beyond therapy direction, right? And the question is whether or not we're going to be able to have those therapeutic benefits without being pushed inexorably in that direction of enhancement, right? Francis Fukuyama, who's a prominent political scientist and philosopher, he refers to this as a devil's bargain, right? That biotech, in a very unique way, offers us a devil's bargain, that there are very real benefits here, but what's the problem? The benefits seem to be, or the harms seem to be embedded inextricably so within the benefits. And the question is, can we have one without the other? So some of the potential treatments here, right, would involve, creating stronger bodies, right, more powerful minds, both for ourselves and for the children that we may, in the near future, very carefully design and select, right? So this is going to be, I think, an increasing issue as we go forward, the possibility of something like designer children, right, genetically engineered children, where in the near future you don't hire a wedding planner, but you hire a child planner. And as you seek to carefully select and design really every aspect of your child's life. So I think biotechnology will offer us the option of controlling our genetic composition, right, our genetic profile, I think in ways that were just previously unimaginable. So, a figure like Aristotle, St. Thomas, I don't think they would have ever really conceived of something like this. And nonetheless, I think they do give us really important principles that we can use to think through these biotech developments. Right? So, another theme that comes up here, right? There's a British philosopher and bioethicist named John Harris, Alan Buchanan as well. He's a very prominent bioethicist. He was the director of the National Commission on Bioethics in the Obama administration. Julian Savulescu, who's at Oxford University, who has a chair in moral philosophy at Oxford. They have all argued that we should replace natural selection with intentional genetic modification, right? That we might move from unintended genetic modification to intentional genetic modification, and that would be superior to allowing the evolutionary process to sort of stumble and stagger along. And that actually there's a moral imperative for us to do so, to seize control of this process and to bring principles of distributive justice to bear upon this process. So that's an extraordinary claim. That would be a monumental undertaking that would make the Manhattan Project and the Apollo moon landings, look like child's play. But nonetheless, this is what some of these people are advocating for. Okay, they especially express great enthusiasm for what we might call, or what they call, a post-human or transhuman future. Right, the idea that we need to transcend our humanity, and they often tend to be very dismissive of any concerns or reservations raised by critics about biotech enhancement. They often try to dismiss these criticisms as being arbitrary or being sort of religious superstition, right, or kind of status quo bias, right? But in response, I would like to argue that we in fact can make a very powerful and very reasoned case against many of these technologies, right? And that we can bring, I would say, the very best of Aristotelian-Thomistic philosophy of nature and metaphysics to bear on these questions and to provide us with ethical guidelines that might guide the deployment of these technologies, okay? So I wanna start out here by talking about, I think if we're going to really assess these new technologies, I think the best way to do that is just to talk about just the nature of the human person and just what are we, just what kind of thing are we, right? Which was ultimately a metaphysical question. It's an ontological question, right? And it involves just a descriptive account of what we are, right? In particular, I want to argue that human persons are bodily organisms, right? That we are essentially bodily beings of the species Homo sapiens, right? We're not ghosts inhabiting a machine. We're not some type of a spirit that somehow invades or occupies or possesses a living body. Our bodies are not extrinsic to us. They're not tools that we use and then sort of cast off, right? We certainly see this view in Plato, right? Socrates, as he's being sort of led off to his death there, and the Phaedo, he seems to be very much at peace. And one reason why is he says, well, this is not really going to harm me in any way, right? My body is just sort of a cloak that I can cast off, right? I'll also use that analogy of a pilot navigating a ship, right? Where our bodies would be somehow extrinsic to us. There's some type of a tool or instrument that we use, but they're not really us, right? So I want to really push back, especially against that kind of Platonic dualism or Cartesian body self dualism or Gnosticism, which I find is surprisingly very, very prevalent, right? We live in an age in which people espouse sort of radical materialism and reductionism and physicalism and sort of constantly, celebrate, these various forms of kind of hardcore physicalism. And yet when it comes down to it, I think many of them really are what I would call Gnostics or sort of Cartesian body self dualists. So I think once we've gone over that descriptive part, all right, I want to talk a little bit more about a more normative consideration here, right? I think we need to think about, right, what really truly constitutes human benefits and harms, right? And I think that's ultimately going to be rooted in some account of, again, what we are. We need to have some understanding of the human good if we're going to talk about benefits and harms, as these people argue for, right? That there's all these various benefits that biotech would offer us. Okay, so I think that's just probably the best way to begin to frame this. Okay, so proponents of biotech enhancement argue that biotech will make human life better. Right? We need to think about, well, what does that really mean for human life to go better? And that all people, right, share an ethical obligation, a moral obligation to avoid harm and to promote benefit, and especially to alleviate suffering. right? So I want to start here by evaluating, right, biotech with an analysis then of just what persons are, right? And so thus what truly counts as a benefit or a harm, right? I think it's precisely because so many contemporary moral philosophers and bioethicists have impoverished accounts of what human persons are and what they ought to be, right? That's important to recognize that, what we ought to be in some sense is rooted in the completion, fulfillment, or perfection of what we are, right? So if we're going to talk about human perfection and what we ought to be, we need to have a very clear account of just what human beings are, right? What is human nature, okay? And I think because of this, right, it's not surprising that they arrive at equally, I would say, impoverished conclusions regarding these new biotechnologies. So I would say that many of these accounts fail in at least two different ways. I think the first way is by presenting very inadequate theories of personal identity, and secondly, by advocating very thin, very subjective, very relativistic theories of the human good, right? So let's just think about that first question of personal identity, right? Are we bodily animals, right? Or are we something other than a human animal, right? Are we somehow a soul or a spirit or a ghost, right? A center of consciousness? Are we merely a brain, right? That is somehow linked with a human body, right? That's somehow associated with the human body, that possesses a body, but also can, come and go, right? I think Plato, Descartes, John Locke is another good example of this. I think in many ways, Locke's shadow hangs over much of contemporary bioethics. A figure like, Peter Singer, Marianne Warren, Michael Tooley, very prominent contemporary bioethicists, when it really comes down to it, have embraced a kind of Lockean conception of personal identity, right? Locke will argue that you get multiple persons inhabiting the same body, right? Or different persons at different times. I think all of this is just incoherent. Okay, if you look at people like Singer, Jeff McMahon, Lynn Rudder Baker, right? I think what's going on here is that they've been, so impressed by our rationality and the personal qualities that human beings exhibit, right? Especially, self-awareness, kind of psychological continuity over time, that they tend to identify the subject of these personal attributes as something distinct from the subject of the biological attributes of the human animal, right? So I think the result then is that the entity that thinks and speaks has desires and decides to take action to fulfill those desires is described as a person, and yet this person is somehow other or something other than the bodily animal, something other than a human being, right? So they'll make this distinction all the time between, having a biological life and having a biographical life, right? And as only persons or biographical beings who have moral status or dignity or rights, and mere living biological organisms, these sort of biological human beings do not have any real dignity, moral worth, or rights. Okay, so that's going to have all sorts of ethical implications, and that could very easily take you in a very dark direction very quickly. Okay, so let's think about where this takes us, right? I would say that this type of dualism inevitably separates what, in fact, are integrated aspects of our lives into very fragmented, alienated parts, right? With such a separation, I think it becomes very difficult to explain how we acquire knowledge of the external world, right? If I am simply a mind or a ghost or a spirit, then the impact of the external world on my body, on my senses, is not an impact made by the world on me, right? It's impacting my body, but it's not impacting me. So the effect made by the world upon the body must then in turn be made upon the mind by the body. But it's not clear at all how substances, which are so radically distinct, right, one that's purely material, the other that's purely immaterial, right, can have causal impacts on one another. Right? This is an issue Descartes wrestles with. He never really comes up with a solution that satisfies anyone, really. And I think it is another major problem here, right, if you're a dualist, is to assume that whatever mental representations, right, whatever mental contents that I have, right, in fact, are really accurate to the world as well, right? I would say for the dualist, the mind is at such a distance from the world that knowledge begins to seem impossible and skepticism begins to loom very large. Okay. I think another major problem here is just how two substances can be co-present in the same place at the same time as well. Okay. So, just to step back here, I think these, sort of Gnostic, Cartesian, Platonic accounts, they have seized on something important, right? There is an important truth here, right? That our rationality is an important part of our identity, but they've neglected an equally important aspect, which is our embodiment. The fact that we are essentially living biological organisms, that we are rational animals, as we're going to talk about, right? So I think another point that's important to keep in mind here as well is that, like all other living biological organisms, right, human beings exist through time, right? All organisms lead temporal lives, and the nature of those lives can only be understood by looking not at a snapshot, not just a single synchronic moment, but at the characteristic way in which such lives unfold in time or over time, right? So if we look at humans in the embryonic or the fetal stage or the infant stage, right? They do not talk or walk yet, right? That's clear. Yet, I would argue that even before, right, performing these characteristically human actions, a human being's life is unfolding, right? I would say that most capacities for most complex living organisms take time to develop, right? They unfold temporally. So it would be a mistake to assume that the organism does not exist until it can perform all of its characteristic activities. And this is very important in bioethics, where this is a very common mistake, I would say, is that people look at a zygote or an embryo or a fetus or a person, elderly person in a PVS state, or somebody who's has advanced dementia or is extremely disabled, has severe cognitive disabilities, that somehow because they're not performing all these characteristic activities, then they're not a person, right? Or they have not yet come into existence, or they have ceased to exist, right? So some of these people that I mentioned, like Peter Singer, Jeff McMahon, Michael Tooley, Marianne Warren, they will all defend these claims that you can lose your personhood, your moral status, or you don't even begin to possess it until some later point in time. Right. So obviously, this is going to leave huge groups of human beings very vulnerable. Right. All these embryos, fetuses, infants, the elderly, the disabled. These are this is going to be, I think, a major issue. Okay. So, right, if all of this is true, if human persons are fundamentally bodily beings and living biological animal organisms, if our identity persists across time, and if most human capacities take time to develop, right, then it seems clear that human persons come into existence when the biological organism comes into existence. And the question then is, when is that? I would argue that any serious reading of the scientific information and data makes it clear, right, that human organisms come into existence at conception. It's at conception that substantial change takes place. Once that fertilization process comes to an end, right, it's about a 2-week process, right? When that sperm penetrates, right, the ovum and gives rise to a new genetically distinct and complete organism, right? I would say at this point we have substantial change. Everything after that is simply a matter of growth and development, of accidental change, and that will continue until biological death. Okay, and that's an interesting question as well, as to when do we die? I think it's in some ways it's easier for us to specify when we begin to exist, whereas the question about death is much more complex metaphysically, and there's a very important debate about this as well today about so-called brain death. And should we accept this notion of neurological death or brain death, or should we hold on to the traditional criterion of the cessation of cardiopulmonary function? Okay, but just going back to all these other individuals, right, that we've been talking about that can't talk or can't walk or are not manifesting those distinctive rational capacities human beings have, right? Even in the case of embryos, they don't even yet have a brain, very early on. Nonetheless, I would say it's clear that it is the same biological entity that will develop through a self-directed process to more mature stages of human life. Once you have that single-celled zygote, and once you have that inner cell mass, you have all the information you really need in that DNA, which will then guide and direct that process, right? So this is an important Thomistic principle here, that there is an intrinsic active principle, right, that is guiding that process of growth and development. It's not an extrinsic principle, the way that you would have with, say, an artifact that requires an extrinsic principle, right? Like a hammer needs to be put together by an external agent, right? Once you have that zygote, you have that self-directed process that will continue to develop and will eventually manifest those rational capacities, provided that it's not killed, or provided that it is given the proper uterine environment and care later on as well. Okay. So I would say that same human organism at different stages of its life is described as an embryo, as a fetus, a newborn, an infant, a toddler, an adolescent, a teenager, an adult, an elderly person, and so on. I would call those sortal terms. This is a term that comes from logic. So a sortal term refers to a stage of development. All those terms, right, embryo, fetus, newborn, and so on, they don't refer to a distinct kind of thing. They refer to a stage of development. In contrast, I would say person refers to a kind of thing or a type of thing. It defines the kind of thing that we are. And these other terms specify the stage at which we are as persons. Okay. So there's a substantial identity that persists through time from conception to natural death, I would say. Okay. So throughout this span of time, right, human beings will develop new capacities, right? But it is the human being who develops these capacities. It is you and I, right? You are one and the same person through all of those temporal stages, right? And that's going to persist throughout your entire lifespan. Okay. I would say at the same time, we remain the same individual, the same substance, even if we lose certain capacities that we once possessed. Okay. This is very important when we get to these end of life issues, especially, right? If we went blind, right, or if we were unconscious, right, we would not cease to be, right? If your body is alive, right, then you are alive because you are a body, right? Your body's not something extrinsic to you, right? At the beginning of life as well, you don't become a person at 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 16 weeks, right? I think the Gnostic would have to say there's some type of extra biological event going on there where, some kind of spirit invades, that living biological organism, right? I would say likewise, if we were to lose the use of a limb, or if we could not swallow food, let's say that you need to be fed through artificial hydration and nutrition, right? I would say we still remain fully human, even though we are injured or disabled at that point, okay? The capacities that we can immediately exercise at any given moment do not define the type of creature that we are, okay? Rather, instead, I would say it is because we are certain types of creatures that we have certain basic natural capacities, even if these capacities are injured, underdeveloped, or disabled. Right? I would say no disability to these capacities, no injury to these capacities would mark the ending of our lives. Okay. We do not cease to be, I would say, until our biological lives come to an end. And I would define this as the cessation of integrated organic functioning, right? When that is irreversibly lost, when our bodies are no longer capable of self-directed, integrated organic functioning, right? And then we can debate about, precisely what does that look like physiologically? When is that lost? When do we no longer have that capacity for self-directed, integrated organic functioning? Okay. So I would also say that stressing the fact that we are animals, I mean, St. Thomas makes this claim that animality is an essential property of persons. This does not undermine our natural or theological understanding of ourselves as persons, right? I would say while we are animals, we are a very, very unique, distinctive sort of animal, right? Obviously, animals that have extraordinary capacities for rational thought, for free choice, for rational deliberation, right? While other animals may be sentient and conscious, right? It is only human animals that we call persons who engage in acts that demonstrate an ability to grasp rational arguments and to act for the sake of reasons. Okay, very, very important. I would say we are, right, in summary, human persons from the first moment of our existence and remain persons throughout our biological existence. Okay, so that's kind of the descriptive account of just what we are, right? Of I would say, an accurate account of human nature. So if we're going to talk about the human good, we're going to have to talk about the kind of thing that we are. I would say that goodness is an attributive adjectival. That is, goodness refers to, it always refers to a specific kind of thing, right? So we're going to talk about a good pen, right? We have to know what it is to be a pen. We're going to talk about a good knife. We have to know what it is to be a knife. We're going to talk about a good phone or a good computer or a good car and so on. We have to have some understanding of the nature of that thing. I would also say some understanding of the telos of that thing, right? And this is why function argumentation is so important, because it specifies the purpose of something, right? And it gives us an evaluative, it's a way to evaluate individuals as good or bad instances of a kind, okay? So something I want to emphasize here as well is what we might call self-constitution, right? The human persons are unique in the sense that our nature involves deliberation and choice, right? It involves reflection upon what ends will we pursue, okay? And this means that what we are is in some sense a function of what we choose, okay? Human nature includes not just what is given, right, biologically or through our genetic profile, but also refers to that horizon of reasons that orients human agents to what they could become if they were to realize, perfect, complete, or fulfill their nature, right? And that's going to be really the heart of the moral life, is our attempt to really complete and perfect our nature, okay? So I would say that, you know, if we look to Aristotle and St. Thomas, they give us, right, I think a very powerful, very compelling case of the kinds of reasons for action that human beings should respond to, the goods that perfect persons, right? I would say that the foundations for human action and self-constitution should be found in the well-being, fulfillment, and perfection of persons and communities as well, right? I would also say that, you know, human fulfillment, the human good, is also something that's going to be complex. It's going to be variegated, that there are irreducible dimensions of human well-being, and there are a variety of reasons of intelligible action that are possible for human persons, and thus multiple goods that might ground this action guiding aspect of human nature. Okay, so I would say this search for the human good, right, is largely ignored in contemporary bioethics. It's often bypassed, right? People say, well, I don't want to get bogged down in all these debates about the human good or whether or not there is a human telos, right? And I would say that's just really the heart of the matter. That just can't be sidestepped. It can't be avoided, right? I would say that what often happens is that, you know, once they've identified human beings as this sort of locus of self-consciousness or this sort of, you know, mind or spirit, I think they tend to go on to argue that human fulfillment or perfection consists solely in pleasure and a kind of hedonism and the satisfaction of desire. You see, you know, preference utilitarianism showing up here, or especially in autonomy, right? And especially in the Kantian accounts, you see a focus on, you know, autonomy as a kind of self-legislation, kind of self-creation, self-fashioning, right? So the idea is, as long as a person is acting out of his or her own volition to fulfill his or her own desires, there are no further considerations of what makes for a good life. Okay, and I would say that's just an impoverished understanding that's going to run into all sorts of problems here, right? I would say, in fact, we need to really reflect upon the various activities, the various states of affairs, and especially the excellences or virtues that make for a truly flourishing life, right? What are the virtues? What are the goods that will truly complete us as the kind of thing that we are, right? I think that's really where we need to look. That's where we need to go. So I want to start to talk about, I see we've got about 20 minutes left. I want to talk about some of the means that are being used today as well in contemporary biotechnology, And I want to raise some questions about whether or not they truly respect human beings as subjects of moral worth, right? And whether they truly respect human flourishing and the various goods and virtues that constitute human excellence and perfection. I would say that if these technologies, right, are to be ethical, then at the very least, the methods they employ should not do any harm. Okay, so that's a very basic moral principle, bioethical principle of non-maleficence. Right? This is the heart of the Hippocratic Oath as well, right? That very important principle of, first, do no harm. Okay. But I would argue that these technologies, as they exist today, are in fact doing a great deal of harm. Okay, I'm going to point out some instances where this is taking place. I would say that if anything, the biotech advances that are coming will probably do even greater harm. So I want to point to two specific areas where these harms are located today. I would say the first is human life itself, especially in its nascent stages, at the embryonic stage, especially, or at the fetal stage. And then secondly, I want to focus on marriage, and that includes reproduction, includes family life. All right, so let's think first of all of the threats to human life itself. Okay, I would say that respect, right, authentic and genuine respect for the life of human beings can be disfigured or trampled upon in at least two different ways. I would say first, the means used for making so-called progress in research might be insufficiently respectful of the life and bodily integrity of human beings. And I think embryonic stem cell research is probably the best example we have of this today, right? Where a human being is used solely as a kind of source material for scientific research, where embryos are essentially kind of strip mined for their biological material, right? They're harvested for their parts, right? And as we harvest their parts, I mean, they are very clearly killed, right? So there's all these euphemisms that are used, like disaggregating, or there's all sorts of Orwellian euphemisms that are used here. But I think it's pretty clear this is an instance of killing a human being, right? I think this same basic ethical problem can emerge at the end of life as well, right? Especially to the old, to the elderly, the debilitated, the disabled, those who have lost so-called higher brain functioning, right? But I would say this is a fundamental injustice, right? Human beings should not be treated simply as things, as research subjects, as objects to be experimented upon, to be mutilated, right? And the research must not cause direct harm or death or pose undue risk to them either. Because most mature human beings can speak out in our own defense, right? The most pressing concern today, I would say, is that those at the margins of life, those at the boundaries of life, those at the beginning of life and those at the end of life, the danger here is that they will be exploited and essentially used as sort of raw material to be, manipulated or and sort of directed towards whatever ends we have. Okay. Another concern that I would have is that human beings are now being created as subjects of experimentation, right? So human beings may be brought into existence just simply to test pre-fertilization genetic engineering, right? So for example, germline cells, such as sperms and eggs, can be altered and then brought together to create a new human being, a human being brought to life solely to see what effect the genetic alteration has on the resulting life. I think if you look at cloning techniques as well, obviously many human beings will have to be brought into existence as the results of these cloning experiments. If you look at Dolly, for instance, the famous, sheep that was cloned in Scotland back in 1997, a lot of people don't realize that Dolly was actually number 271. Right? There were 270 earlier versions of Dolly that were radically disfigured and, had all sorts of genetic abnormalities and died very, very quickly, and in many cases, sort of horrifically. I would say that many of these human beings then would be physically disfigured, right? Would be deformed, and that would be the result of trying to perfect that procedure, right, through trial and error. And most, if not all, right, human beings created as test subjects will be destroyed before being fully gestated. I think another concern here has to do with chimeras, with transgenic species, which are increasingly being used as well in biomedical research, where we've now created human mouse hybrids, we've created human ape hybrids that are being used in biomedical research and experimentation. This raises all sorts of questions about the moral status of these beings and whether or not we should even be engaged in this research at all. So I would say this research, right, will go wrong if it does not adequately respect human life, right? If we treat human beings simply as mere means, as disposable material, or as objects of consumer choice. I mean, that's a concern that I really have as well. Dr. Cass, I think the article by Dr. Cass about the coming age of biotechnology was shared with everyone as well. That's a point he keeps coming back to, as well as the commodification of human life, where we increasingly see other human beings as consumer products, right? As objects of consumer choice, and the resulting devaluation that takes place as well, the dehumanization that takes place as well, right? So let's think, for instance, about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is becoming increasingly common, where human embryos that carry certain genetic markers for disease or disability are frequently discarded. This is taking place in the IVF process. In a generation or so, this may be the case with nearly every pregnancy, where every pregnancy is scanned for certain genetic markers. And I think the question here is, are we going to be able to resist simply selecting against certain genes for genetic traits, that might lead to ALS or Huntington's or something like that? But will we also be pushed in the direction of selecting for certain traits that we regard as being desirable? So increased intelligence, increased height or attractiveness or athleticism, or having a boosted immune system. And all of that might be done with just the click of a mouse, right? Moving that mouse a quarter inch. And the question is, will any of us really be able to resist that temptation to select for and not simply against certain diseases? Okay, so I think this same technique could very easily be applied to create designer embryos, designer children with specific sex, hair, eye color, muscle type, eventually even personality, things like that may be able to be affected by these interventions. Okay, I would say as a result, though, right, disrespect for human life, right, would not be merely a side effect of this research, but may also serve as the very selection factor itself, right? With the so-called lesser human beings paying the price, right? Where you might create, through an embryo factory, you might create 1,000 embryos, right? And choose only one of them to be implanted or to be placed in an artificial womb. And that's another biotech intervention that's coming. Artificial wombs are coming in the next decade or so. I think that may really revolutionize the whole abortion discussion in our country as well. But I think that the concerning here is that these so-called lesser human beings would really pay the price. They would be discarded. Those other 999 embryos would likely be discarded there. Okay, so I would say these procedures disregard the fact that all human beings at all stages of life are persons whose lives are to be respected and to be promoted, right? Experiments we would not think to perform on mature persons, right, whose objections we would take as definitive, right? We are blithely performing on immature or elderly subjects, right, on human beings. I would say this violates very basic norms of justice, fairness, equality, to use human beings, immature human beings or elderly human beings, in ways that we would never countenance or allow for mature human beings, right? So going back to that point we made about human nature, right, and having a sound philosophical anthropology, once you recognize that there is a substantial identity, right, between, right, a zygote and the person that you are now, right, and you recognize that it's wrong to kill paradigmatic persons or to manipulate them or to experiment upon them, right, and if you are one and the same substance, right, and there is that substantial identity, right, we should be able to recognize that it's also wrong to experiment upon or to destroy these human beings who exist at the so-called borders or margins of life. I would say that if moral worth and dignity sprang forth from the type of creature that we are, and I would say that is the case, not necessarily the talents, skills, and capacities that we can immediately exercise that specific moment, I would say that what's going on here is that we are causing, in many cases, direct, irreversible and lethal harm to subjects and human beings who do in fact possess, I would say, profound intrinsic dignity and value, and that this is being corrupted or debased when we treat them in these ways. I would also say that we damage ourselves. And this is a really important point. When we engage in serious moral evil, we harm ourselves. This is a point that Plato keeps making in the Platonic dialogues, right? That, engaging in serious moral evil is a kind of self-harm. It's kind of self-mutilation, right? The Divine Comedy, Dante uses the image of someone biting their own neck, right? I would say that we corrupt and damage ourselves, but also we corrupt our moral ecology. I think this is a really important point as well. Is not only is there a natural ecology, there's a moral ecology as well, right? And when these serious evils or injustices are present, and especially when we establish institutional practices that embody, right, these vicious actions, right, I would say that leads to a kind of cavalier disregard for the well-being and the dignity of our fellow human beings, right? And I think this is going to have a very corrupting effect on all of us. I think insofar as we write them off or disregard them as not really human or not really lives of value, I would say that we narrow the circle of humanity, we cheapen and coarsen the value of human life, and we set our own wills in opposition to the authentic good and value of other persons, right? I would say we fail to recognize that these persons have a good independent of our own, right? And we set our wills in opposition to their authentic good, right? And I would say we harm the common good in that way. Okay, so I would say because of this, right, regardless of what ends, right, biotechnology may promise, if the means required, right, causes us to disregard the humanity of our fellow persons, right, they will never make us better off. In the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit more about how biotechnology may pose a threat, not just to human life itself, but also to really central social institutions as well. And I want to focus especially on marriage and the family. I think this is probably where we're going to see some of these harms most clearly. I would say a very important aspect of human perfection and fulfillment is social and political. This is a point that Aristotle keeps making at the beginning of the Politics, right? He says human beings are social and political animals, right? That we cannot be eudaimon on our own, that we need one another, right? He compares us to bees, right? That wherever you find human beings, you find them living in community, right? So I would say that in particular for human beings, there is a very unique combination of friendship, of sexual union and reproduction that we call marriage, right? This is a very, very unique human institution, right? And that any biotechnology that would weaken the bonds of marriage or corrupt its essential contours would diminish or even prevent genuine human flourishing and well-being, right? So let's talk about, there's research today aimed at making us asexually reproductive. This is probably going to be technologically possible relatively soon, right? We may start to see asexual reproduction soon. And I think it's important that we can give ethical arguments as to why someone should not go down this path, right? I would say that, one driving force behind this, right, this attempt to make procreation purely technical, right, and, this sort of solitary individual effort as well, is certainly the desire to produce healthy children free from disease, right, perhaps even having the sort of enhanced genetic composition that we talked about as well, right. Nonetheless, though, right, I think there are very important concerns here about a world in which reproduction, right, takes place solely in a laboratory, right? I would say this is a different and lesser thing than traditional procreation in the context of marriage. And I want to point to two things in particular as to why that might be. The first point I want to make here is that sex and marriage, by their very nature, are other related interpersonal realities. Okay, by their very nature, they are interpersonal and they are other related. Okay, I would say that our human fulfillment and well-being, right, requires, right, essentially requires our relation to others, right, especially in these goods such as friendship, marriage, and the like, especially at the family, Okay. So the danger here is that if we narrow our reproductive choices in our world in this very self-focused, self-centered way, by becoming autonomous procreators, I would say this really reduces our possibilities for well-being and may even actually preclude the very possibility of well-being altogether by removing us from those others with whom we would have had the potential for genuine interpersonal communion that might actually perfect us. I would say that a world in which all reproduction becomes disjoined from sex would be deeply depersonalized and dehumanized, right? There's a guy named Ray Kurzweil you may have heard of. He's one of these sort of tech fabulous. He's obsessed with radical life extension, and he takes over 600 pills per day in the hope that he will live long enough to either be cryogenically frozen and sort of resurrected someday, or that we might find some way to kind of slow down the aging process. But he has this vision of, a kind of virtual sex between avatars, right? I think this makes the point very clearly that this would be a world in which, these relationships have become deeply depersonalized and dehumanized. I would say further that reproducing in the lab takes one very important aspect of what makes marriage perfective for us, which is procreation, and it separates it out of this very unique and very fulfilling opportunity for genuine interpersonal union and communion. I would say the result then is a kind of impoverished, diminished version of the truly fulfilling activity of procreation when it is part of that much larger interpersonal good of marriage and family life. I would say in the end, we are left with the illusion of the real good, right? That's found in family life and marriage and rearing children. Okay. So I think another concern that I have here is that this world of assisted reproductive technology is just shot through with this language of spares, uh, defect, right, with the grading of embryos, right, with the elimination of the lesser in favor of the so-called better or the more perfect, with selective reduction of some or selective killing of some for the benefit of others. I would say in all these various ways, right, people are being drawn into a kind of depersonalizing mindset, right, that seeks to create children according to the parents' own specifications. And this essentially becomes a kind of manufacturing process, right, where again we see persons as simply as things or as objects to be manipulated or to satisfy whatever preferences we may have. Okay. And with every form of manufacture, faulty attempts are scrapped, and this drive towards mastery over what is made is allowed to have full reign, right? At this point, I would say it's just spiraling out of control. There's a very good book by Michael Sandel called The Case Against Perfection that I highly recommend, where Sandel will really argue that what's fueling this process is what he calls the Promethean impulse. St. Augustine in The City of God will call this the libido dominandi. He will argue that this is one of the deepest wounds of original sin, is this desire and this drive towards mastery and towards domination and towards control. We may be seeing this especially in an era of biotechnology. And I think it's so important that we cultivate, there's certain virtues we're really going to need in a biotech age. I would really emphasize humility, responsibility, and solidarity as three really key virtues that we're going to need in an era of biotech. So I just want to finish here with one final point. I would say that the hidden rational basis for that many people have when they hear about these things, when they hear about some of these forms of biotech, when they hear about transgenic species, when they hear about putting animal faces on human beings, when they talk about designer children, I think most people have some kind of intuitive sense that these are violations of human dignity. Right? I think most people experience a kind of moral vertigo, a kind of unease. They feel, there's a kind of repugnance. They feel kind of queasy, right? Because I think they have an implicit, though at times unarticulated, understanding that human beings are persons. That is, we are subjects of moral worth, and that every person, right, possesses the same profound, intrinsic, and equal dignity. I would say that's a bedrock principle of Catholic bioethics. And that dignity requires that we orient and direct ourselves toward persons in certain ways, right? I would say that there, as I've indicated earlier, there's all sorts of improper ways that we might orient or direct ourselves towards other persons, right? And it's absolutely crucial that we orient ourselves towards other human beings as equal in dignity and equal as a person, right? And we recognize that these acts, by their very nature, denigrate persons, right? I would say the very act itself, in many of these cases, is denigrating and fails to respect the proper dignity of persons, regardless of any consequentialist considerations that may arise here. So I see I'm out of time. I want to open up the floor for any questions that anybody may have. There's so much we could talk about here, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Furlan. Any questions or comments from participants before I launch into a few of my own? Give them a second. Okay, well, let me ask a question. What kind of reception have your ideas received in the world of ethics?
Yeah.
Are you a lone ranger out there?
Thankfully not. No, I think there, within academia, there are people doing really good work, important work. We may not be in the majority, but nonetheless, there are important voices, who are drawing on, Aristotle's philosophy of nature, drawing on Thomistic metaphysics, drawing on natural law theory to articulate many of the points that I just did. I would also say in the general populace as well, there is deep unease here about many of these biotechnologies. I think there's very real concern. I think people may at times struggle to articulate that. And I think that's where, people who have a background in philosophy can really help, and who have a serious background in philosophy of nature and metaphysics especially, can help articulate those concerns I think people have about depersonalization, about dehumanization, and really the loss of our humanity. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, if you look at, the Journal of Christian Bioethics, which is published by Oxford University Press, if you look at, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, yeah, these debates continue to rage. I think there is a very concerted attempt by, those who may not share these views to kind of shut down debate and to try to delegitimize other viewpoints. I think that's very common. You see this with embryonic stem cell research debate, which thankfully has died down quite a bit. I would say in 2007, there was a really important discovery. There was a Japanese scientist who actually won the Nobel Prize, where it really led to breakthroughs with adult stem cells. So I would say that debate has really died down quite a bit, where there's really not much need for embryonic stem cells anymore. We can basically do whatever we need with adult stem cells. And so it's important to recognize nobody was ever opposed to stem cell research. They were just opposed to killing embryos for the sake of their.
So does that mean that kind of embryonic stem cell research is gone now?
Well, so it depends on where you're at. So in the U.S., the compromise that the Bush administration came up with and is that they would allow for experimentation on existing stem cell lines, but not to create any new ones. In some sense, this may, this is in the United States, but there may be other places in the world where, you're seeing in a place like China, for instance, much more aggressive embryonic stem cell research, right? So that's going to be a larger discussion here, as well as, Fukuyama has argued that if we're going to regulate these technologies, it's going to have to be done on a global level. And the best analogy we have, he argues, are nuclear weapons treaties, right? And we're going to have to get a buy-in from everybody, right? Because it's not hard to imagine a scenario where North Korea or China begins to even mandate genetic engineering for their citizens. And then the rest of us may be sort of drawn into that, right? I mean, that's another interesting dynamic that may unfold here as well, where if some of us, let's say Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Jeff Bezos or some of these people, begin to genetically engineer themselves or their children, that may force all of us onto that path, right? The sort of gen-rich scenario, the kind of genetic aristocracy scenario, right? Where the rest of us may not have much of a choice if we're struggling to keep up, if our children are struggling to keep up. We may be sort of forced down that path as well. So one thing I find really fascinating is why is this project, which begins as a celebration of autonomy and freedom and self-creation and self-fashioning, in the end, this may rob us all of our freedom and our autonomy.
It's like the steroid use in professional athletics. If several of them are doing it, then everybody else is going to feel intense pressure to do it as well, just to keep up.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Lisa wonders whether you can suggest resources that we can use to educate ourselves and others, something less intimidating than journal articles,
Yeah.
something we could share with family and friends.
Yeah, I would recommend Michael Sandel's book, The Case Against Perfection. I think he is a really talented teacher. You maybe seen his justice course that he offers. It's a really popular course here at Harvard. He's written that book, Justice, and he's given lectures, in soccer stadiums of 20,000 people. That's pretty remarkable to, get that number of people to show up to hear a lecture on moral philosophy. But his book, The Case Against Perfection, I think is very accessible. I think he makes several great points there. Francis Fukuyama's book, Our Post-Human Future, I think is very good as well. Fukuyama goes very deep there. I think he's, I would say the shadow of Nietzsche hangs over that book. He's terrified that some of Nietzsche's predictions may be coming true about the last men and about, the emergence of sort of inegalitarian forms of society. And he's really fighting against that with every ounce of his being. I would say the work of Leon Kass is outstanding as well. He was a teacher of mine at the University of Chicago. The article that I shared, The Coming Age of Biotechnology, is profound. He has a whole series of essays I recommend. He has a great article on death called The Case for Mortality that's very profound, where he argues that, in fact, that it's good that we die. And that's actually a gift and a blessing. But
Nice. We'll have to get this list from you, and we'll put it up on our webpage with the recording. Mark, did you have a question?
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Tim. Thank you for your lecture here, and very helpful and edifying, especially as in a Catholic school setting, where the kids are becoming seemingly more detached from reality in the world, and which really attacks the human nature. And so, I guess apart from the two texts that you mentioned earlier, is there a way, Doctor, that as administrators and teachers, we can illuminate or at least give resources to the parents and to the primary school kids that you would suggest?
Yeah, you mentioned, I see this with young children as well, that they're just addicted to screens, they're addicted to social media, they're constantly online. I am very kind of concerned about that. And I would say, first of all, just emphasizing authentic human interaction, right? And limiting and sort of minimizing that focus on screen time and constantly being online. I think I'm very worried that something like Plato's Cave is being dug right now as we speak. I mean, you look at the virtual reality technology that's coming. If you look at, video games in the 1970s, you look at them today, imagine what they're going to be like in 50 years. If you look at like the Oculus device, for instance, right? I mean, it's not hard to imagine something like Robert Nozick's, experience machine coming at some point in the near future. The other point, going back to your question, Mark, and I think it's an important one, is I think the focus has to be on cultivating certain key moral virtues and spiritual practices that young people are going to need in order to live well in an era of biotech. So there's going to be certain key virtues that parents and teachers are going to really have to focus on inculcating in those children. And this is a whole other debate as well in biotech about moral bioenhancement, whether or not we can engineer people to be more moral. Should we give them, drugs that would sort of make them, more altruistic or something, less selfish or less aggressive or less violent? I would say no, there's no shortcut here. There's no biochemical shortcut to happiness or to virtue. And that in the end, we're stuck with virtue, so to speak. We're stuck with that hard work of cultivating these key cardinal virtues that we all need in order to live well. And the only way that young people are going to receive those is through virtuous parenting and virtuous teachers that model and embody those virtues and manifest them in their own lives, and then are able to inculcate them in their children. And there's no doubt about it, that can be a long, difficult, arduous process, but there's really no substitute for it.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Another article that comes to mind too is an article called Restless Souls by Peter Augustine Lawler. I think it's a really profound piece of work. I think sometimes when people hear about some of these technologies, they tend to get, really kind of down, right? There's a book called Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari that was a bestseller. And, Harari has this sort of nightmare dystopian kind of brave world portrait of what may be coming. And a lot of people, when they hear about this, they say, well, I really hope that I'm dead when this happens, right? But the Lawler piece is very interesting because it's very, very hopeful. And he says that, we may, in the end, we may hit sort of rock bottom. We may end up in something like Plato's cave, but eventually we will ascend. And he's very, very sanguine about that. And, there's nothing in this world, there's nothing in this life that can satisfy the infinite desires of the human heart, right? I think, this is how I finished my course on the ethics of biotechnology. I really emphasize this point that there's nothing in the world that can really satisfy our deepest desires, right? Our desire for the infinite. And we're going to ultimately have to look elsewhere. We're going to have to look, I would say, to God to really satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. And there's really no biochemical shortcut or substitute for that.
Okay, let me just ask one last question. Is there any suggestions you have for what we might do in high school with high school students? What they might read, what we might have them think about that would help get them in the right position to deal with these difficulties?
Yeah, good question. Many kids are already reading, Brave New World. They're reading 1984. They're reading things like that. I mean, I think Huxley's Brave New World is a profound piece of work. I mean, it really is.
We read that in high school. We read both of those books in high school, and they just had such a huge impact on me. I never forgot them, and it really has directed my moral judgment about these matters from that time on.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are powerful texts. I think literature can be very powerful, especially pedagogically with young people. I think literature, especially if we're trying to cultivate a moral virtue, it can be so helpful to have a concrete example. I think that can be much more useful than like an abstract general principle or formula, where if you're trying to understand the virtue of generosity, there's somebody you can point to, right? There's a concrete example of the virtue of courage or the virtue of heroism or the virtue of honesty or selflessness or self-sacrifice. So I think it's just so important that we as teachers, as educators, as parents, we're seeking to cultivate these virtues ourselves. We're seeking to embody them. We're using great works of literature to introduce young people to these key cardinal virtues. Yeah, those are two works that come to mind. The other works I recommended as well. And I'm happy to, I'll write up a list as well of other texts that may be helpful.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Furlan, and thank you everybody for joining us. As I said, we're going to skip next week because we'll be at our national conference. And but after that, in two weeks from Wednesday, we will be joining Dr. Gregory Roper from the University of Dallas, who will be talking about a great work of medieval literature called The Pearl, which is a dream poem in which a man is able to meet his daughter who had passed away at a young age, and she introduces him to the heavenly Jerusalem. So it's an excellent poem. All right, well, thank you all.
Thank you.